being a parent and what all that involves. This obviously, of course, is a high-level overview. There's no way we can go into all the details involved and answer all the challenges that parents have to deal with. And before we get into that, you've probably already noticed that something's happening in my voice tonight. So I'll try to get through this. I don't know what it is. I'm not sick that I know of, but allergies or something. I'm fading fast. Before we get started in our study this evening, let's go to God in prayer. Father, we're very thankful that you've given us another good day of life. We're grateful for all the rich blessings of this life. We know that every good and perfect gift comes from you. We appreciate so much your generosity in sharing these things with us. We especially are thankful this evening for the opportunity that we have to come together as your people, to open the pages of your book and learn things that will help improve our service in your kingdom, especially in our role as parents. We're so thankful for the children that you've given us, for the joy and the happiness they bring into our lives, but we recognize the awesome responsibility that rests upon our shoulders to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Pray you would grant those of us who are parents the wisdom and the patience to do this job well. We are most of all thankful for your Son, Jesus, and for the perfect example that he left us when he lived upon this earth, for the sacrifice he was willing to make to redeem us from our sins. Help us always look to him for the guidance and strength that we need to get through this life. In Christ's name we pray. Last week, we looked at this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Whole idea of preparing ourselves to the task of parenting. And let's look at this passage again. You shall love the Lord your God. This is Moses speaking to the children of Israel just before they're going into the promised land. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. And the thing we were trying to draw out of this passage last week is that parenting is a full-time job. Whatever you do as a career, working outside the home, that just pays the bills. Your primary task is raising these kids that God has placed in your care. And everything you do in your life is directed to this task of bringing these children up as God would have them to walk. But there's one phrase in here that really is pertinent to our lesson this evening. And that's the statement that Moses says, you shall teach these words diligently to your children. And that's the subject of our study tonight. Moses emphasized to the children of Israel that you've got to teach your children, the next generation, the things that you have learned about God and what God wants you to do. And of course, this is not unique to this passage. There's so many passages in the rest of the Bible that emphasize the importance of parents taking an active role in instructing and teaching their children. Deuteronomy 4, 9 through 10. Take heed to yourself and diligently keep yourself, lest you forget the things your eyes have seen, unless they depart from your heart all the days of your life, and teach them to your children and your grandchildren, especially concerning the day you stood before the Lord your God in Horeb, when the Lord said to me, gather the people to me, and I will let them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children. Look also in the book of Proverbs is just rich with injunctions concerning a father teaching his son in particular. The whole book is structured that way. It's a father passing along the wisdom that he has learned to his offspring. But notice in particular this passage in Proverbs chapter 4, and I've highlighted some of the key language in these verses. Hear, my children, the instruction of a father, and give attention to no understanding, for I give you good doctrine or teaching. Do not forsake my law. When I was my father's son, tender, and the only one in the sight of my mother, he also taught me, and said to me, let your heart retain my words, keep my commands, and live. Hear, my son, and receive my sayings, and the years of your life will be many. I have taught you in the way of wisdom. I have led you in right paths. My son, give attention to my words, incline your ear to my sayings. Notice the language here. My law, my words, my commands, my sayings. Now, in order for a parent, a father in particular, to fulfill this role, what does he have to do? Speak the words. Yeah, I mean, he has to be delivering something to his children for them to pick anything up from him. And did you notice also, second verse here, when I was my father's son, he taught me. So what do we see here? There's 3 generations involved. The speaker speaks of when he was a little child and his father taught him, and now what is he doing? He's passing that knowledge on to his son. And this, it's a generational handoff. And of course, historically, the problem is somewhere along the way, one generation gets sloppy. And they don't do a very good job of handing off the wisdom they've learned to the next generation. So then what does that next generation do with that lack of knowledge? Make poor choices, poor decisions. And of course that lack of knowledge will come back to bite them. Look in Isaiah chapter 38, verse 19. King Hezekiah is a speaker here, and he's praying to God. And here's part of his prayer. The living man, he shall praise you as I do this day. The Father shall make known your truth to the children. The irony in this statement is King Hezekiah was one of the best kings in Judah's history. Good, decent man. Came on the scene at the right time to save Judah from certain conquest by the Assyrians. And so here's this good man who prays to God, and he recognizes in this prayer that one of his responsibilities is to, as he says, make known your truth to the children. What's the irony here? Who was Hezekiah's son that succeeded him on the throne? Manasseh. Tell me about Manasseh. He was one of the worst kings, polar opposite of his dad Hezekiah. So what happened here? We don't know the whole story, of course. So we have to be careful in passing judgment on Hezekiah's failure here. We just don't know the details. But something didn't work. We don't know if Hezekiah was too busy running his kingdom and saving his kingdom to save his own kid. We just don't know the whole story here. But for some reason, something went badly off the rails, and the nation of Judah paid a price for that. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul gives us that same truth. Fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. Other translations have different language here for that last phrase. Teach them and instruct them, or training and instruction of the Lord, or education and counsel the Lord approves, or training and teaching of the Lord. Actually, the New English Bible uses language that it really kind of forms the framework for this lesson and next week's lesson, the instruction and the correction of the Lord. Tonight we're talking about the instruction of the Lord. Next week we're going to talk about the correction of the Lord. But the idea is that God places the responsibility for training the next generation squarely on the shoulders of the parents, especially the fathers. And of course, today in our society, fathers, if they are present at all, are denigrated. They are mocked as being doofuses that have no clue what they're doing. And as I said, if they're even around at all, there are far too many children being raised without a father at all in their life. And those kids suffer for that lack. So then, what we're going to do this evening is spend some time talking about what we are to teach, and then also how parents are to teach. So let's spend some time talking about what to teach. There's so much that we could cover here, and for sake of time, obviously, we're going to have to keep it short. But I think the best way to approach this is to look at a passage that Jesus pointed to as really the focal point of our lives under God's oversight. And that is the statement that he made in Matthew 22. When somebody approached him and asked, what's the greatest commandment in the law? This was Jesus' response. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now this is such a broad description of our responsibilities in life. Of all the things that God has given us, Jesus boils it down to these two elements. We're going to spend just a little time talking about this. Actually, there are three elements here that we can pick out of this that apply to raising kids. The first one has to do with respect for God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. What does it mean to love God? In the context of raising children, what are we trying to teach them? Be faithful and obedient to God. It's important that children obey parents, yes, but first, what are we trying to train them to do? Be obedient to God, right? How do we do that? Model it. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Are we fulfilling this instruction by dragging our kids to church a couple of times a week? See some shaking heads. Explain. Taking them to church is a good supplement. It reinforces what should be happening at home, right? So parents need to understand the primary responsibility. In fact, these passages we're looking at earlier in Deuteronomy and Proverbs and Ephesians, who's that directed to? Do we need to go back and look at them again? Parents, particularly the fathers, right? Parents need to recognize that the responsibility for teaching and training the kids rests squarely upon their shoulders, the parents. Church is simply a tool, an aid to reinforce the teaching that they're getting at home. If you're not teaching your kids anything about God at home, church is at best a poor Band-Aid. Michael? Yeah, parents have to be totally invested in the lives of their kids. A lot of extraneous stuff. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. So parents have to teach their children respect for God. Give me some practical examples of how that can work out. Say in the course of your weekly experience with your children. What are some practical things you can do to teach respect for God? I'm sorry? Pray with them? Yeah. When our children were little, we had 2 boys, 2 girls, and they were all kind of crammed close together. And we started very early, when they were very young, the habit of when we put them down to bed, Melissa would take the 2 boys or the 2 girls and have them say their little prayers after she tucked them in. I'd do the same with the other 2 kids. The next night we would switch off. I'd do the boys and she'd do the girls. But what was the purpose of that? What were we trying to accomplish? I'm sorry? a relationship with God, and prayer is a big part of that. Now, those prayers were very simple, but they very childlike, but they're children, right? But it was important that they be introduced to the concept of talking to God on a daily basis. Same thing with studying their Bibles, reading their Bibles. But then there's a second thing that's mentioned here, and that is you shall love your neighbor. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is respect for others. How do we teach our children respect for others? Okay, by showing it, yeah, setting an example. Right, no doubt. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even within the family, isn't respect for others pretty important? Just within the confines of the family. How mom and dad treat each other, how mom and dad treat the kids, how the kids treat each other. I mean, this is a training ground where children learn how to get along with and respect the rights of other people around them. But there's a third element here in this passage. Can you imagine what it is? We don't usually spend much time on this, but it's really pretty important. Yeah, respect for yourself. You are to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, what's the kicker here? It implies that you have self-respect. And that's a major problem that we're dealing with in our society today. There are far too many people that have little or no respect for themselves. And if they don't respect themselves, how can they respect other people around them? That explains a lot of the social dysfunction that is plaguing our society today, because there are a lot of young people that have grown up and have never been taught to respect themselves, that they have dignity. I'm not suggesting here, and Jesus is not saying that, we see ourselves as the center of the universe, and I'm the greatest thing that ever walked. No, that's not what Jesus is saying here. That we need to have a certain sense of self-confidence, of self-respect, so that we can treat other people with dignity. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. We have to take care of ourselves. And to the extent that we respect ourselves, love ourselves, we can show that same respect and love for others around us and ultimately for God. And so there's a number of different things that we could look at here. We won't spend any time looking at these. This is just kind of a brain dump of the kinds of things that we ought to focus on teaching our children. Faith, hope, love, the big three that often are brought up in the Bible. That, of course, is obviously directed primarily at God. Honesty, self-control, there's the self-respect. Humility, compassion, patience, generosity, developing a worth ethic. Optimism, loyalty, both to God, to our community, to our family, to one another. All of these things, and so many others that we could add to the list here, all of this is the package of what it takes to raise a child up to be a healthy, responsible adult. And we as parents are responsible for instilling these qualities, these characteristics in our kids. And we have, frankly, a very short window to do this in. So when the Lord blesses us with little kids, we need to recognize we have a task placed on our shoulders. And that is to teach our children the basic life skills that they need to be successful in life and to be an asset to their community rather than a liability. Now, next, let's talk about how we teach these things. And I'm just going to lay out some basic guidelines here, and you can probably add to these yourselves. Number one, set age-appropriate boundaries and objectives. What's the difference between a boundary and an objective? A boundary is a line that you set, and the warning to the child is you do not go past that boundary. It confines the child, right? And the objective then is what? We're pushing the child beyond their own self-imposed boundaries. Are children comfortable being pushed to do something they're not comfortable doing? No. Yeah, there's personality involved, of course. But I have to use the phrase age appropriate here. We need to use wisdom in how we set these boundaries that hem them in, and then the objectives that we're pushing them to accomplish. But at every stage of life, we need to be reassessing the boundaries, kind of expand the boundaries out a little bit as they get older, and then keep pushing them to achieve more and more objectives in their life. This is what helps them to grow and develop talents and skills and abilities they may not recognize they have. We also, in teaching our children, need to distinguish between defiance and mistakes. What's the difference between defiance and mistakes? Intention. Explain. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I like your explanation. Intention is really what we're trying to judge here. When we give a child an instruction and the child just stomps the foot and glares right at us and just says, no, what is that? That's a challenge. They're throwing down the gauntlet here, and you as a parent have to respond to that. Go ahead. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Yeah, and you have to respond to that. Didn't quite make it, yeah. And let's talk about mistakes a little more here. We spoke of that passage in 1 Corinthians 13 where Paul talks about when I was a child I put away childish things. One of the childish things that children struggle with is the fact that their skills and abilities are pretty limited. And the younger they are, the more limited their skill sets are. And they're going to mess up. They're going to make mistakes. And again, as Lenise pointed out, what's the intent behind the mistake? If they're sincerely, genuinely trying to do something and they fall short, we have to cut them some slack. But we can't just crush them because they made an innocent mistake. So there's a great deal of wisdom that has to be used here to distinguish between willful defiance and honest mistakes and treat them accordingly. Also, it's important that children have praise for the things that they do accomplish. Why is this important? That we praise them for what they accomplish. It builds up their self-confidence, their self-esteem. It makes them feel like, I'm successful here. I'm accomplishing something. And that reinforces future efforts at trying to achieve something in their lives. So it's important that we do praise their accomplishments. What's the danger here in our praise? It has to be sincere. Yeah. It has to be earned. right? When we praise a child, make sure it's something that they have genuinely accomplished. If all we do is just heap effusive praise on our kid 24/7 about how great and wonderful and awesome they are all the time, what are we doing there? Probably spoiling them, yeah. I mean, we're inflating their ego beyond where it ought to be. And then also this statement that Paul makes, which is, the older I get, the more I appreciate the truth that Paul is laying out here in Ephesians 4:15. Speak the truth in love. We need to speak. We need to talk to our children. Develop lines of communication with our children. Develop such a relationship that they know that if they have a problem, an issue, a fear, they can come talk to us about it, and we will talk to them. We'll give them the best advice that we can give them. And, of course, obviously, what we talk to our children about has to be the truth. We're not going to lie to them, and it needs to be in love. And children can sense if the words that we use, the message that we are communicating, is in love or if it's in something else. And we need to always evaluate our own intentions and motives in the things that we say and speak to our children. And then there's one other thing that I want to put up here, and actually Larry already touched on this a moment ago, and that is set an example in your own life. And this is huge. All the rest of this stuff really doesn't matter if you're not living what you're preaching. Right? And that's true in every relationship in life. If you're going to be in the position of trying to help, guide, lead somebody else, but especially your children, anything that you're teaching, that you're saying, is going to be nullified if you're not setting an example of what you're teaching. And so as a parent, you need to constantly be examining yourself, your own personal life, your attitudes, your motives, your behaviors, your relationships with other people around you. Is your life modeling these things that you're trying to teach your children? As Larry said a moment ago, perhaps the single greatest thing you can do to teach your children what the truth is on all of these life issues that are before them is to show it in your life. They will see that, they will appreciate that, they'll be impressed by that more than anything else that you say or do. Okay. And related to that last point in Proverbs 4, we looked at this a moment ago. Receive my sayings, in the years of your life will be many. I have taught you in the way of wisdom. And then notice the follow-up phrase, I have led you in right paths. And there's the two elements there. I'm teaching you something and I'm leading you. I'm showing you in the life that I live. Okay, in the time that remains to us, very quickly, some questions. What's the difference between teaching and screaming? Is there a difference? One is under control and the other is not under control, right? And when your children sense that you're just losing it, I mean, you're just going bonkers, your influence is greatly diminished at that point. You've got to keep yourself under control, no matter how frustrated you are with what your child is doing. If you resort to screaming and yelling at your child, that probably is going to be counterproductive. What if a child counters why? You parents, okay, that's answer number one, because I said so. Now, is it appropriate sometimes to give a rational reason for the boundary or the objective? Of course, yeah, and it's reasonable. If a child honestly doesn't understand, okay, explain it to them. If they still come back and say, well, why? Then you resort to, because I said so. Yes? An age-related, age-appropriate explanation. Yeah, that's a good addendum. Okay, now here's one that might engender some discussion. Should children be paid to do chores? Yes or no? I'm sorry? Pay them in privileges, giving them opportunities to do things, yeah. Let me just, we're right out of time, so let me just share my opinion on this, and this is not a hard and fast rule. If we set up a system where we are paying our kids to do chores as part of the family, what are we training them? What are we teaching them? Well, we're teaching them a mercenary spirit. I do X amount of work for X amount of pay. Now, there'll come a point in their life, obviously, where, that's the way the world works. But what if the child says, I don't really need the money, I just won't do the chore today? Then what leverage do you have? I mean, you set the parameters of that relationship, right? My personal opinion is children should not be paid to do chores. Give them an allowance separate from their chores. That's fine. That's good. And, teach them the proper use of money and so forth. But personally, I think it's probably not healthy for children to get in the mode of doing their chores only if they get paid for it. They need to do chores because, why? They're part of the family. They have to pull their weight. Do you get paid for washing dishes or washing clothes and mowing the yard and all the other stuff that you do? No, it's just part of running a family. And children need to learn that. Okay, next week we're going to be talking about the other side of the discipline equation, and that is correction or punishment, if you prefer that phrase. And there I think we'll get into a lot of interesting information. Thank you very much.